As Jordan said, I'm Mike Arkin. I'm CEO of Big Boat Interactive. We're a independent development studio in Los Angeles. And my talk is about a game called Battlezone 98, Redux. And as I say, it's the world's greatest do-over. And I'll explain why in a second. Here we go. So who am I? I'm a 30-year veteran game producer. And I started in the game industry at Acclaim in 1987 when I was 18 years old. And I worked at Acclaim, Sony, Fox, Activision, Crave, Mumbo Jumbo, and I had my own studio called Zona, which I didn't put on the list. I've shipped over 100 games as producer, and that ranges from, I did all the early Simpsons games, the first WWF games, the Die Hard trilogy, which was a huge, successful game, AVP, UFC, Tokyo Extreme Racer, and of course Battlezone. So I currently run Big Boat Interactive, which is a development studio. I do some consulting, production consulting. I have always a couple of small projects, mobile projects, things like that. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter. And if you tweet the talk, I have Steam codes for the game that I'll hand out at the end. So a little bit of history, how we got to the part that I'm going to talk about today. In 1995, I did a game called Alien vs. Predator with a team called Rebellion in the UK. And at the end of that project, I fled to go work at Activision on a project that at the time was called Lost Brigade and eventually became Battlezone. So 1998, I went to work at Crave, and after that, Zono, Mumbo Jumbo, Skyworks, and eventually started Big Boat. And like I said before, I did some consulting, some mobile apps, and some PC apps, and a bunch of other things. And around April 2015, I was approached to do a relaunch of Battlezone on Steam. And so for those of you maybe who have never heard of Battlezone, what is Battlezone? Battlezone's a PC game that shipped in 1998. And funny enough, that was the same week as StarCraft. Wasn't so funny at the time. And it was really the two most successful genres of gaming at that time were first-person shooter and real-time strategy. So there were people at Activision who were looking at those two genres and saying, how can we combine these together into one game? And so they came up with this idea that you were playing from the first person, but you had all the strategy controls of a typical real-time strategy game. It was a very highly rated game. So we had 95% reviews, 5 stars from PC Gamer. We were on the cover of Next Gen magazine, and it was this great story. It was basically the Cold War in space, on the moon, on Mars, and it was a real-time strategy game, but played from the first person. And here are the crude 1998 graphics. The game ran at 640 by 480 because that's all PCs did at the time. And it was very low polygon with very low res textures. And again, like I said, we were on the cover of Next Gen magazine. I love the quote, which was, sorry, it's really small. A revamped Battlezone shows the real graphics power of the PC, which is very funny because of how incredibly crude the game looked at the time. So, like I said, I was approached to take that old game, and we had the old code, and could we make a new version of that game and relaunch it on Steam? It had never been on Steam before, and so this is what we did. We said we're going to take the original game, the original code, we're not going to touch gameplay, but we're going to upgrade the renderer, we're going to put in all new art, we're going to tune up all the special effects, upgrade the terrain, just generally make the game look much prettier, but leave the fundamental gameplay exactly the same. Multiplayer was basically no longer functional because there was servers that no longer ran, so we moved everything over to Steam, and added all the kind of typical Steam stuff like invites and achievements and all that stuff. And our big new feature was modding. So the original game had lots of mods, but they were things that you had to manually copy and edit text files and things like that. So we integrated Steam Workshop, and so we had the system where you could click on a mod, it would download, and it would just automatically integrate into the game with no extra work. So yeah, in fact, as of today, there are over 318 mods on the workshop for the current game. And those mods are like single-player maps, multiplayer maps, graphic mods like new skins, HUD mods, game balance mods. Basically anything in the game that we expose, can be modded. So it's like almost anything we could do, you could do too. So this is the new version of the game. It's as I said, vastly upgraded in terms of the models and textures, and we put in a new HUD and all kinds of new graphic whiz-bang. Here's just a little quick before and after. This is the main tank in the game. It's about 200-300 polygons, and then we upgraded that to 10,000 polygons. And now instead of textures being 128 by 128, they're like 1024 by 1024. So it's pretty dramatic, but the one thing you can see is that we kept the original look. So it still looks like the same vehicle. We're not changing the art direction. We just made everything look nicer. One point here is it's the same art director who did the original work, so he was able to kind of keep the same style, or maybe like, how would I have made this look 17 years ago if I did it in high poly? So the team was myself, it was the original lead artist, original gameplay programmer working part-time, and a new programmer who was kind of the lead. So there's a lesson learned there, which is never try to do anything with less than 2 programmers. It's too easy for things to go wrong. That's a lesson that applies to all development, like never, ever, ever have less than 2 programmers. And the funny thing is, I already knew this lesson. I've learned this lesson like 5 times before, so there's another lesson learned, which is please stop forgetting your lessons. Excuse me. So when we hit that wall, we realized that we missed a few things when we planned, so we added a couple more programmers. So we added basically 4 more programmers over 3 or 4 months, and we brought in some experts at some particular disciplines where we needed help. Okay, so anyway, the kind of point of the talk was to talk about the community and how I brought in the community to help us. So one of the things that we did at the very beginning of the project was we brought in about 15 to 20 of the top guys from the community. So we were really lucky that over 17 years that this game had been out, people were still playing. And they were going through extraordinary lengths to actually make the game continue to be playable, but it was such a fun game, particularly in multiplayer, that we still had this really hardcore group that was playing the game. And so I basically picked and chose 15, 20 of those guys that were the ones that were doing modding, the ones that were building maps, the ones that were really like experts at the game, and I pulled them in and brought them on board as beta testers. And in almost every possible case, they knew the game better than I ever did. I worked on the game for about a year, and then we shipped, and I never played it again after that, and which is typical in game development, right? But these people were playing the game for 15 years, so they knew every mission and every in and out. What was also like a big difference today versus 15 years ago is that most of these players are now some kind of amateur game developer. So we now had this beta test team that were also skilled at various elements of game development, whether they were actually ever making a game or not, but they still had these skills. So everybody signed an NDA. That's obviously very important. I created a Skype channel, just threw everyone in the Skype channel and just kind of sat back and watched them talk. This was great because I got to immediately see in real time kind of what they thought was important. What did they want to see changed? Occasionally I would pop in and say, hey, what do you think about the art of this one aspect of the game? And there would be, 4 hours of rabid discussion. We built a Google Doc for people to basically start putting that stuff in writing, and with tabs for like suggestions versus graphic bugs, et cetera, et cetera. And then we just started pushing builds to Steam and let them play. And having this real-time feedback was incredible. The combination of Steam, Skype, and like a Google Doc meant that we just were constantly in this mode of gathering real-time information from this hardcore group that knew the game 100 times better than I ever did. So I call them the betas, but basically, they knew the game really well. They were all super passionate, and there was this element that really surprised me, that they all just wanted to help. In fact, when I say they wanted to help, I mean, if there was something that someone could do, they would just do it. And so when there was a piece of art that was wrong, the next day someone would just send me a fixed version of the art before I would even ask. It would show up, and at some point I had to tell people, like, stop doing that, because it kind of got ahead of some of the decision making. Hey, maybe we didn't want to fix that art, or maybe that wasn't the way I would have fixed that. So we didn't always kind of see eye to eye, but clearly the passion was there. And so, of that group, we had all these people with different skills. So, a couple of them were engineers. Not necessarily games. One guy was a full-time engineer, and they just started writing tools. So one guy was like, hey, you have this terrain system, and there are textures that need to be packed into texture atlases, and he just wrote a tool to pack the texture atlases. And we were like, hey, we could use that. Like, that's cool. We were doing it manually in Photoshop. So again, like, because they were so passionate, the beta testers just started doing stuff. We also had a bunch of artists on the beta test team. So again, like, when we didn't clean up the art on one UI screen, one guy just grabbed the file and just like went into Photoshop and fixed it. And just one day it just showed up like in my email, like, here's a fixed version of that screen. Are you going to put it in the game? And eventually I just kind of relented and said, okay, sure. And I started going out and getting permission from people to use their work, because I mean, if I didn't, I'd have to answer to this, to this team. So another example was that all the collision in the game used some tools that none of us knew how to use. And one of the beta testers was literally like the last person on the planet that understood these tools. And so when we had collision problems, she would just suddenly say, okay, I'll just fix it. And she would just like deliver a fixed version of the collision. And it was something that we thought was impossible. Like, oh, those tools don't work anymore. And I actually had her write me a document of what you had to go through to make those changes. And it was like 4 pages of, like, there's no way I could even figure out how to do that. But she knew how. So we're just like, okay, if you need collision fixes, like, this person will do that for you. And I think that was like a really, it was like a big step, because these beta testers, instead of just being testers, were now volunteering to kind of help get the game done. And little things add up, and what they were doing was like hundreds and hundreds of little things. One designer said, hey, I understand how the scripting system works for all the special effects. And he just went through the game and just tuned up all the special effects. And at some point, like in the beginning, I was saying, let me see what you want to do with that one, let me see what you want to do with that one. And finally I just said, okay, fine, just whatever, just do it. And he just went through the whole list and kind of revamped every single special effect in the game. And that was great. I mean, we would have shipped without it, but he certainly contributed and made the game a tiny bit better. Because these players had played the game, 100 times each, they knew every level of the game. And so we had lots and lots of mission bugs. And it was incredibly valuable that anytime a programmer wanted to fix a mission bug, he had, 10 people he could instantly chat with that knew exactly how every mission worked. We would have spent weeks playing and learning the missions because, well, 15 17 years ago, this was done by the designers who had actually designed the mission. And that knowledge was long since lost. So we were able to use these beta testers to like really give us all this knowledge that they had, and that saved us a lot of time. I mean, it was great. And I know that they hate to hear that there were people that didn't play the game, but you know, some of the members of the team had never worked on Battlezone before. So they played the game, but they weren't certainly going to spend 3 weeks becoming experts at the game before they worked on it. And yeah, we fixed hundreds and hundreds of mission bugs like that. And some of those, you know, it's funny, I mean, some of those were bugs that we didn't fix in 1997 when we shipped the game. And there were bugs maybe that got missed, or there were bugs that got caught that we were in a hurry, and we didn't have time to fix them all. So I would constantly say, oh man, I can't believe they did that. And even though, of course, it wasn't they, it was me, but oops. And the beta testers had a lot of great ideas. You know, when we were brainstorming, they had all these, like, hey, can you add this? Can you add this? And because we really wanted to make this the ultimate version of Battlezone, I mean, you know, probably the last version of Battlezone ever made, we certainly wanted to take their ideas. And but they had great ideas. I mean, you know, we did custom campaigns based on beta testers saying, if you add this feature, we will create custom campaigns. The beta testers were like, please have faction-specific HUDs. We will absolutely integrate that into the game. Please change the collision system and all the modding stuff. So I'll just kind of skip through this, but you know, there was also another external community that we didn't work with as closely, which were people who had been playing the game for many years, and they were not as helpful. They were quite they had some really strong opinions about the game, and they didn't necessarily respect what we were doing. So you know, that led me to really think about how much work should we do to satisfy this very vocal minority. And it's tough, because if you do everything, then that's a lot of feature creep. And as I like to say, feature creep is bad, or else it would be called feature nice guy. So anyway, so how did it all work out? We shipped in April 2016. July, we shipped the expansion. This is an expansion that had basically never been available. It had shipped 400 copies in 2009. And we did a Mac and iOS version, which basically shipped like 2 weeks ago. So it worked out, I guess. And you know, basically the lessons learned was it's great to have a big community. Even if your game doesn't have that pre-made community that we had this advantage. There were people playing the game for 17 years. Make it. You know, find some passionate people. If your game's a first-person shooter, find passionate people from other first-person shooter communities and make them your guys. Make them your guys from the beginning, before you've started making the game, and let them grow with you, because that will build that passion, and they will have the sense of being part of the team, which will make them want to be helpful. And then once it's there, use them. They are your greatest asset, because you know, you can, in my case, we quadrupled the size of the team by adding all these beta testers, and you'll get a better game. So, you know, what's next? You know, I don't know. I'm always looking for other classic games that need to be redone. So, any questions?
So for myself, this game is bringing back a lot, because you ran on the platform that I helped write back in the 90s with 9X stuff. So that's something for me, and it was very popular amongst a lot of us who worked on Win 9X platforms during the evenings when we were supposed to be writing code. But with gauging the audience, how did you try to handle someone who is maybe very passionate? I did see some of this earlier, where there were people who were passionate, but how dare you touch this, were passionate and did it, but maybe did not have a direction, but you did not want to lose their input because they had a lot of great input. You just had this one stuck point where you wanted to go north and they wanted to go south.
Yeah, and what's really funny is it wasn't just a random thing. It was actually some of the most valuable members of that community were the ones that I disagreed with the most. And the reason is that they had this raw passion but didn't have the direction that I had. I had direction. I had financial goals that I had to get done by a certain time, you know, things like that. look, a wise man once told me, you have to be really careful when you ask people for advice, because if you don't take that advice, they're just going to get mad at you. And sometimes you're better off not asking. I mean, to answer your question, how did I handle it? I just, I made it clear to them that I wanted all the feedback, but that there were times where we weren't going to take it. And sometimes in specific instances, someone would say, can you do this? I'd say, no, we can't do that. Like, I'm sorry, keep giving me feedback, but we have very specific direction that we're going to be following, and that may not fit in with it.
Cool, thank you.
I have a question. Well, I'm just starting out as a game dev. I graduated, 3 months ago, something like that, and I've already had my hands in like 5 or 6 titles that have something that I've worked on in it. Usually just me passing code at people, but I've worked on a handful of games already. And I'm assuming you've worked on a huge number of games. Are there any games that you've worked on that you wouldn't want to see Redux of? That you made, and you're like, I'm never touching that again?
Yeah, most of them. I mean, I worked at Acclaim in the 80s, so while I probably shipped 40 or 50 games the 5 years I was at Acclaim, most of them were garbage. And that's just a function of, that was the output of that company. They were a company that made games based on licenses, not necessarily high quality product. But then on the other hand, I've worked on, a half a dozen games that were A+ games that maybe someday will get redone. Who knows?
What are your thoughts on putting together community-based expansions? So you got cool content from people who really dig the game, and then you want to grab some of that up on Steam, right, with the stuff they make for the workshop. And then, you prepare something that you want to sell, and then they get some rev share. Like, are you thinking about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And that's certainly something we thought about, because Steam enables that. So you can flip a switch and the workshop has paid content. So anyone that makes a workshop item can put a price tag on it, and it's for sale, and we get a piece of that. We didn't go that route, so we just made it all free because we just wanted there to be all this content to help kind of just make the game more interesting. And even during the development, like that beta team that I talked about, a lot of them were mod makers, map makers, and were building a lot of content. So they'd say, hey, how about this thing? And I would say, well, we're not going to do that, but make that into a mod. Make that map, put it on the workshop. And that was one of the ways that we got that, over 300 items on the workshop, was that I purposely was pushing them. Like, for example, all of the old maps that were made 15 years ago, and there were hundreds of them, could be run through a converter and basically re-released with the new textures and the new terrain. And so I was, pushing the beta testers to get as much of that stuff out there as they can. But I think, in a future game, it might make sense to do it as paid content also. It's not a bad idea. That's it, I guess. Jordan, do you need to wrap up, or? Thank you.